I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whomever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll, and this is a continuation of our comparative religion class, although taught at an unusual time. And I want to remind everyone we have this class webpage you can go to for links to a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. There's some intense data stuff going on today, so go there to get the links for where that is, sites.google.com/view comparative religion. If you're watching online, I'll put it in the video description, but in that URL I'll have recommended readings, books, extra things you can look at and read, and the links to all the data I'm using today. So, we've done a lot of stuff on Mormonism, and I thought I was done. I did lecture 1 on influences in Joseph's early life in the Book of Mormon, and then his later life and his martyrdom. Then we talked about Mormon beliefs, theology. We talked about all the things Mormons believe, do, why they believe it, how their theology works. And then we talked about the things they do, covenants, rituals, practices, and temples. And then we did something we hadn't done before, but that I want to do for all the religions we're talking about, and that is, at least when they're living religions. I can't do it for ancient Egypt or something, but we invited a believer to come in and tell us what it's like to be a Mormon. And that was done just last month, and it was new, and we'd never done it before, and it was so nice and so exciting. I loved it, that I thought, well, now we need to do one more. It really felt like we needed one more to round this out, because we have Mormonism's past over here, and this is kind of Mormonism's present, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of Mormonism. So what we're going to do today is we want to talk about some statistics, some demographics, and some trends. So how do you predict the future? Well, you look at what's happened in the past, and you kind of predict it forward. You try to see what you think is going to happen in the future. So that's kind of what I want to do today, especially since some of this data is really, really interesting. So if you're a sociologist of religion, what you care about, among other things, one of the main things you care about are what we call the 3 B's: belief, behavior, and belonging. And so we care about those 3 things. And belonging has a lot to do with self-identification. Do you identify as a Unitarian Universalist? Do you identify as a Mormon? And if you do, well, then what do you believe? And what does your belonging to that group make you believe? And how does your belief differ because you belong to that group? And how do you behave differently because you belong to that group? And you can do that for politics. You can do it for religions, and we're going to do it today for Mormons. And it occurred to me that I love doing this so much because it combines everything I love: religion, sociology, and numbers, statistics, because I'm a statistician. Right? So, that's my day job. And so this is just so exciting. I thought we should really do this for politics. We should do it again for all these different religions that we've taught. We should even look at kind of the changing face of U.S. religious landscape. There's so many subtopics down here that I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about this stuff, because we've talked a lot about different religions, but we haven't really approached them from this perspective, even though I love doing this. And it occurred to me that I should probably do some of that at least and see if it has some interest from you guys. So today I'm going to focus on these. Now, if we're going to talk about the polling and the statistics for Mormons, there's a lot of things we could talk about, but I had to narrow it down because I have about 45 minutes. And so I decided to talk about its growth, which is incredibly interesting to me. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? How is it growing? I want to talk about the political views of Mormons, how it impacts their political views and their voting, especially issues then with regard to LGBTQ issues, gender, women's rights, that sort of thing, because there's a history of Mormonism and women's rights movements. And then I want to talk a little bit about race. And I got to drink my coffee while I talk about Mormonism because I didn't sleep at all last night. So, okay. So what can we do here? Let's look at the sources of data, right? So if I'm going to talk about these things, where am I getting the data that I'm describing? Well, there's a bunch of longitudinal studies that are very good, and one of the really good ones is the Church Almanac. It's the 2013 Church Almanac, at least is the one I have, and it's got data, especially going back into the 1830s, that I don't know where else to get. And then we have from 1970 to 2019, the LDS Church, well, I guess to 2018, they haven't done the 2019 results yet, but the church publishes what they call the statistical report. And I know among my ex-Mormon peers, there's some kind of poo-pooing of that report, and that data is invaluable, and it is accurate, despite what you will hear. We'll talk about the limitations of it, though. The interpretation of it is what is almost always wrong. But the data is incredibly useful, and it gives us very rich data on things like how many members do they think they have as they define membership. So we'll talk about that. And it talks about how many convert baptisms they had that year, how many missionaries they had that year, and how many new children were blessed or baptized. That's, again, incredibly valuable data. But it has to be interpreted correctly, otherwise you will come to the wrong answer. Because Mormons interpret a member of their church very differently than, say, the Unitarian Universalists do or the Catholics do. And so if you compare the LDS statistical report data on membership to, say, the Catholic report on membership, it'll look like you're seeing a trend that maybe isn't real. Because the church reports membership, the LDS church reports membership differently than most of these other groups. So again, we'll talk about that. But to get the right answer out of it, to understand what it means, given that they report their numbers differently, you need to analyze it. And so there's a friend of mine named Clint Kimball. I'm going to be promoting his work heavily today. He's got a webpage. I'll show you a link to that, where he goes through the data and analyzes it and tries to get some of these values we might be interested in out of it. And it's incredibly hard, and he's done great work. And so I want to plug him. We also have the GSS survey, which is called the General Social Survey. We also have the Public Religion Research Institute, or the PRRI, who do surveys every year. Both of those do surveys every year. And Pew does surveys every year, but they also do very intense snapshots, where they do kind of deep dive surveys. And they did that in 2007. And again in 2014, called the Religious Landscape Survey. And this wasn't focused on Mormons, but it has enough of a sample that you can dive into the Mormon subsample and ask interesting questions about it. So that's one source. But the most important is the Next Mormons Survey. In 2016, Jana Rice crowdsourced a survey for Mormons. She said, we want to do a survey for Mormons, and everyone's like, yeah, that's a great idea. So they crowdsourced it. They got the data, they went out and got one of the biggest samples of Mormons ever, and it gives you a really clear picture of what's happening to the Mormons in 2016. And in fact, but it is just that 1 year, 2016. In fact, it's so valuable because it's so rich, you can divide it out and still get statistically significant samples by generation. And so that's why it's called the Next Mormons Survey. And the results are published in this book. Although there are also online accesses to the data. There's several online articles that you can look at. So if you go to the web page, which again will be in the video description and/or the course web page, it will give you a link to her survey, and from there you can go to all of the articles that have been written based on the results of this survey. I think it's called the Next Mormons because what it lets you do is take the millennial Mormons out of the other Mormons and compare them. And again, very, very useful. We know from all sorts of other religious data that in every church, the millennials are behaving in a less religious manner than their parents. And so they are more likely to disaffiliate, they're more likely to call themselves nuns, and if they do believe and go to church, they're less likely to behave in the same way or to believe as strongly about the same stuff. And so what we find is that the Mormons are not immune from that trend. We see the same thing in their group. And again, this is the best data ever. I read this and I couldn't sleep. I stayed up all night reading it and I was fascinated. So again, there's no time to talk about all of it, unfortunately. So we're going to just have to pick and choose. But again, we're not just going to talk about the Next Mormon Survey. You get the snapshot from Pew in 2014, and then again in 2016 from the Next Mormon Survey. And you've got all these other longitudinal data sources, including the church's statistical reports. So with that being said, let's start with growth. How is the church growing? And is it growing? This is the data up to 1991, I believe, is where I broke it off. And you get this long, flat tail and this very quick growth. We see this all the time in science where we study population growth. This is an exponential trend. One bacteria splits, you get 2. 2 splits, you get 4. 4 split, you get 8. It's exponential growth, and pretty quick, in about 30 generations, you get 1 billion. So exponential growth is amazing stuff. It takes 30 splittings to get 1 billion, right? And so the church is growing up to 1991, what looks to be exponential. In fact, I can fit it with an exponential trend. So here's my exponential trend up to 1991. And, this people noticed this, and it led to all sorts of headlines. I'm going to read a couple. This is from May 2012, Washington Post. So not from a backwoods place. Washington Post. Study shows Mormonism is the fastest growing faith in half the U.S. PRRI from 2012. Study shows that Mormons are the fastest growing religious group in the U.S. And then we get this study from the religious census that said that Mormons are growing incredibly quickly in the United States, and that was from the 2010 religious census. We really need the 2020. They do that census every year, so that's going to be another great data source when it happens next year. It coincides with the U.S. census. But they survey religious groups. All right, so we got all sorts of data. It looks like the LDS Church is growing exponentially. 2 caveats. The first is that this has to do with reported members. And we'll talk in detail about how the church reports members because it matters. It's kind of crazy. And the next is, this goes to 1991. And notice what it predicts, 26 million people by today. So if the trend had continued, we would have 26 million Mormons today. How many do we actually have from the church's statistical report? So again, from about 1991 till today, things slowed down dramatically. And what we actually have is just over 16 million instead of the predicted 26 million. So if we flip back and forth, you see the difference all the way over there on the right-hand side of this graph between the prediction. And since we're talking about the future and tracking the future from trends, this should be a gee whiz, we should be careful moment, right? Because if you just assume a trend will continue and track it out into the future, you end up being wrong. Because trends don't continue indefinitely, they change. And so we'll have the same problem when we project our trend out into the future, which we will do. But when we do that, we have to recognize that trending is difficult, it's dangerous, and you can come to the wrong answer by just assuming that things will continue and that there won't be a coming inflection point, which there very well might be. So we'll talk about inflection points and that sort of thing. Here's one inflection point. On February 25th, 1996, the church crossed a 20th century historic membership mark when, this is from the church's news release I'm reading, by the way, when, according to estimates by church statisticians, there were more church members that day living outside the United States than there were numbers living in the United States, the host nation where the church was restored nearly 166 years ago. So that was the church report from that day. So the first thing we know from the church is that it was primarily a United States organization, and starting on that day, it had more members outside the United States than in. That does not make it a non-LDS-centric institution, though, because that means all the members outside the United States equal the number inside. But the inside the United States is still where they have the highest population density, and it is still where almost 50% of the members live. So it's the first thing we know about the church is it's a U.S.-centric organization. However, it has all these people outside now, and that's kind of new. So how do we define membership? I've been hinting at that's an issue. The LDS Church defines membership, and among ex-Mormons, they will almost claim this is a conspiracy, like they're trying to inflate their numbers. I don't think that's quite fair, but they do define membership in a way that is favorable to high numbers. And what they do is, and they have doctrinal reasons for this. There are references in their scriptures that say when people are baptized, their names are taken so that they can be found, nourished, and taken care of. So to become a Unitarian Universalist, I signed the membership roll. And my wife, who attends all the time, has never signed the roll. But she attends. Well, the Unitarian Universalists would not consider her a member. The LDS Church, if you are blessed as an infant, you are on the membership rolls until you die. If you're baptized at the age of 8 or over, you are then put on the membership rolls if you're a convert, right? And you're left on the rolls until you die. If they lose track of you and don't know where you are, they keep you on the rolls in case you show up again. And they do so until you're about 110, and then they drop you because they assume by then you're dead, they just couldn't find you. And so and again, I don't think they're doing that just to inflate their numbers. They're doing that because these are the people they're trying to keep track of. And in fact, until about the 80s, you couldn't remove your name from the church records because they felt they had a right to keep track of people who had been baptized. And so you couldn't remove your name. The only way to get your name off the church, if you were ever put on the church, is to be excommunicated. And that requires this whole process. Well, eventually there was a lawsuit, and an individual said that the Constitution of the United States, very interesting argument, guarantees me the right of free association. Therefore, if I choose to disassociate with the church, they have to take my names off the records. And the church fought it, and they lost. And so now, if you want to get your name removed, you actually literally have to hire an attorney and or write a letter that is carefully worded with wording borrowed from said attorneys. There are example forms on the net you can borrow if you want one. And you have to send that letter to the bishop and to the stake president, and then they will contact you. Make sure you know that if you do this, you lose all your blessings and you're going to go to hell. Not really, but you lose all your blessings and it's this horrible thing. And they warn you about it, and if you say, yes, I know that, please take my name, then they'll finally take your name. It's a big, involved process. And what that means is most of the people who've left the LDS Church still have their names on the record. And so that's what's being statistically reported. So what is the activity rate? What we really want to know is how many people would self-identify as Mormons. That's the first question. And that's called retention. And how many people actively go. That's called activity, and they are different. Retention numbers are much higher than activity rates. There are people who will call themselves Mormon but will never go. These are the Catholics, who would tell you they're Catholic until they die, but they never go to church. There are a bunch of Mormons like that. We shouldn't be surprised. So retention is much higher than activity, and we confuse them all the time, and it makes this really even more confusing than it already is. Unfortunately, the church does not tell us the activity rate. So the numbers we would really like are tithing receipts, as from a sociology of religion perspective. What we really want to know about the church is tithing. How much money are they taking in? To sacrament meeting attendance. How many people go to church every Sunday? And next, we would really like to know how many of them have a current temple recommend, because that means they're keeping the behavior. That tells us the behavior, right? They're keeping the requirements of the church to be considered worthy of attending the temple. So those are the numbers we want, and we don't have any of them. And we would really like them, and the church just doesn't give us those numbers. So we have to guess. So here's how we guess. You can estimate the activity rate a lot of different ways, and we're not going to go through all these because there's a lot of math involved. But you can use the number going on missions. If you know the birth rate, if you know how many people therefore are of a certain age, and you know what percentage of them are going on a mission, you can use the combination of the birth rate and the number of children of record added, add 19 years when they go on a mission, 18 years, and see how many actually go on a mission, and that gives you an estimate. It's an underestimate, though, because there's some active believing members who are active but won't go on a mission. So that's a lower bound. You can also get upper bounds by things like the number of births. Because if you're inactive, but if you're inactive and you have a child and a child doesn't end up on the church's record, that means you're inactive because the church can't even find you. So that's an upper bound. So you can do all this math and you can try to figure, and you get these upper bounds and these lower bounds, and you get these estimates, and we even have one leak number which says that the activity rate is about 30% right here. You'll notice the missionary number spikes up because right here they changed the missionary age, and so it's a lower bound and yet it goes high, but then it drops right back down. So you can use all of these things to get an estimate of the activity rate, and you can get an upper bound and you can get a lower bound, and when you do, it's somewhere in this range, and you can get a best guess estimate, and that's the best guess estimate. And I told you that I was going to plug this guy, Clint Kimball. He has a webpage, www.fullerconsideration.com/membership.php. And if you go there, you'll get more math than you wanted, and he'll tell you how he did this. And this is his best guess estimate for activity rates. And you notice there's some funny, interesting things that happen. Like right here, the church purged all the inactives from their roles. It was called, they even called it, like, they had a name for it, like the Awakening. I can't remember now what it was called. But this was during the time of Brigham Young. And so then he makes an estimate that it drops between there and there. He just has to guess. But right here we start getting his real estimate, because that's when the church started releasing statistical reports that he then uses to pull the active rate out of the membership rate. So if you do all of this, and then you say, well, not how many members are on the rolls, how many active Mormons are there? You get this. And this is the best guess we have for the number of actual LDS active believers in the world. And so the top number in blue is the number of the total membership. The green number is the number of inactive members, and the red number is the number of active members, and the purple number is the number of former people who've removed their names from the church. So there's our best guess. And I want to make a couple observations. There is and everyone hates me when I show this graph. No one likes it, right? Because the believers are frustrated because they thought they were growing exponentially, and they thought they had 16 million members, and they don't. Not active anyway. Now remember, retention is different than activity. This is just active. So there's probably higher than this retained members, but this is the active members. So it's not as good as they would like, and they get unhappy. The ex-Mormons really hate it because there's this narrative that floats around on the ex-Mormon Reddit and the YouTube Facebook groups that the church is just hemorrhaging members right and left, and it's shrinking, and it's going to die in a few years, and it's dying. Neither of those narratives is true. The church is actually growing in the number of active members. Even the number of active members is growing, and the number of members is growing really fast. The number of inactives is growing quickly too. But the church is still growing. And again, this is not, what certain people want to hear, but the numbers speak for themselves, and neither group is right if you actually just kind of track what's really happening. Which, of course, leads to the next question. Well, I guess the first question is, if they're still growing, where? So what I've done, this is not what I've done, this is what Fuller Consideration has done. They put all the number of wards and stake closures and openings on a graph. The green points mean a new congregation or stake. Stake is like a diocese. A new congregation or stake was opened. A red dot means a congregation or stake was closed and or merged. And so what you see is that in the United States, the church is treading water, maybe growing slowly. In South America, the church is shrinking. And in Mid-South America, it maybe is growing, maybe shrinking. It's really growing in Africa, which is probably why the Book of Mormon musical had itself set in Africa. But the church is growing in Africa, which is fascinating given the church's history on race. But it's a new population. If you, again, think of that growth in a medium, things grow exponentially. Then they hit limits on growth because all the susceptible people have already been contacted, and it starts to level off. You find a new population, and then that one starts to grow. So they're growing in Africa because it's this new population. There's also some growth over here. They're really shrinking in Taiwan and Japan, etc. And so that's a picture of where the church is and where it's growing, shrinking. So not only can we tell whether it's growing or not, we can tell where it's growing and where it's not. But of course, the next big question is, what's next? So what's going to happen? So to do that, we have to track trends. And when we start tracking trends and projecting them into the future, we know we can be wrong. However, we know we're going to get a few things right because we know the birth rate. And so in 19 years, those people who were born this year are going to go on a mission. So we can do things like project how many missionaries there's going to be in 19 years to fairly good accuracy because they're not going to invent new births that never happened, right? And so there are some things we can track at least out 20 years with reasonable certainty. So let's talk about where that's going to go. First, this is the LDS birth rate, including our projections into the future. And you'll notice in about 2008, it really walked off a cliff, but so did the national birth rate. And the reason for that was, among other things, the recession. But it stayed down after. Nationally and among the LDS Church. And the LDS Church birth rate is above the national, but it's still going down, limiting significantly. So, and if we project that out, we're just guessing, right? But it's a reasonable guess. And so we know, again, the past birth rate, 2008, they're going to start going on missions about 2027. And so we know kind of the number of missionaries we're going to have up to about 2027. And we can get a reasonable guess of how many we're going to have after that. The next thing we know is we know where members come from and where they go. So the green is the number of convert baptisms. And then the yellow is the number that become inactive. The brown is the number that die. And then the red has their name removed. And then the blue is the number who are born in the covenant, which is the LDS Church's name for born in the church. And so you'll notice that the church used to grow primarily from people being born in the church, not from convert baptisms. Those numbers almost double the convert baptisms. That swapped around 1980. And from 1980 on, the church's growth has primarily been from convert baptisms. And so in order to continue growing at the rate they're currently growing, the church must continue to make converts because their birth rate is still above the national average, but it's going down. Well, that depends on them having missionaries. And again, we can project the number of future missionaries based on the number of births. A couple things to note in this graph. The first is that the number of female missionaries shot up in 2012, and the reason for that is the church lowered the missionary age. So in 2012, the church lowered the age, and the number of male missionaries shot up because suddenly there were twice as many people who were eligible to go because they lowered the age. So the number of male missionaries shot up. The number of female missionaries shot up even more because a lot of female people just didn't go on missions because they were, what was it? It was 19 for men and 21 for women. And then they lowered that to 18 for men and 19 for women. And so a lot more women are going on missions, although they only serve for 18 months instead of 2 years. You have to take that into account when doing all this complicated math. And then these are the number of senior missionaries. So this is the missionary effectiveness. So how many people are those missionaries going to baptize? Well, a couple things have changed over the course of history, church's history. Right here, they did something called raising the bar, where they told the missionaries that if you had sinned in the past, you wouldn't be worthy to go on a mission. You had to have been worthy. And they raised the worthiness standards. And when they did that, the number of missionaries dropped because less people were worthy. And you would think that what they'd hoped for is that their effectiveness would go up. It did not. So then they changed the missionary discussions from memorized missionary discussions that I use into this preached by the Spirit here. And there was some rise, but not very big. And then it started to fall back to where it was. And so that's the effect of Preach My Gospel right there. And then they lowered the age. And it turns out that, I think no one is surprised by this, 18-year-olds are not as good at teaching as 19-year-olds, and the 19-year-old women are not as good at teaching as the 21-year-olds. And the missionary effectiveness fell off a cliff, and it has been stable ever since. So we can use that to again, make these predictions, because if we believe that this is the historical number of convert baptisms. So you take the number of missionaries, multiply by their effectiveness, the number baptized each year by each missionary, and you get the number of convert baptisms, which is actually reported. So you actually go the other direction to compute this. But again, lowering right here was the effect of raising the bar. So raising the bar on the worthiness of their missionaries actually caused the number of convert baptisms to drop, not to go up. Preach My Gospel, this new technique for preaching, helped a little bit, but not a lot. The surge did very little. That's when suddenly there were twice as many missionaries out. Their effectiveness fell off a cliff. And then because their effectiveness stayed on that cliff, it's plummeted ever since. Okay, so what's the money shot? This is our projection for convert baptisms, or Clint's projections for convert baptism. Clint Kimball did it once by fitting. You just go from here to here and you fit that slope and you assume it goes down. And that's maybe an upper bound. The other way to do it is to look at the number of missionaries and multiply by their effectiveness, the predicted missionaries, and you get this value, which is significantly lower. Now again, I think these things are only valid for about the next 10, 20 years. After that, who knows what's going to happen. But for the next 10, 20 years, we can make a reasonable guess as to what's going to happen. And so, again, let's go to the money shot. This is those same numbers you saw projected out using the upper bound and the lower bound, and it makes a difference. And so what you see is that their growth, they are growing, They're going to continue to grow to about 2035 here, and then start shrinking, and they're going to grow to about 2030 here, and then they're going to start shrinking even faster. So those are kind of the upper and lower bounds. So they're growing still, but they're about to start hitting a wall and shrinking. And again, we can guess where that growth is probably going to happen, right? Because of this, that trend will probably at least continue for the next little while. But the other thing you can ask is, now we know that they're growing and that their growth is about to stop, and we know the rate at which they're growing, we can ask another question, which is, are they growing faster than the world's population? Because we know the world's population is growing, and there are reasonable estimates for how fast the world's population is going to grow. So if you do that, you get this graph. And what you find is that the number of reported members is still growing, but the number of active members peaked and has been falling for many years now. Notice the world is growing faster than the LDS Church. And so although the LDS Church is growing as a fraction of the world's population, they are shrinking. And that starts about 1998 or so, and then it starts going down ever since. And so, again, there are two competing prophecies of the church's membership in the LDS Church. The first is that the church is like a stone cut out of mountains, taken from Daniel, cut out of the mountains without hands, and it will roll forth until it fills the whole world. And that prophecy is taken again from Daniel. And that kind of predicts that the church is going to grow and grow and grow until it fills the world. Well, that's not happening. The other prophecy that they talk about is one from the Book of Mormon, where a prophet Nephi says that their numbers will be small because of the wickedness of the world. And so that implies that they're going to be small and continue to be small and shrink until kind of the millennium. So if you're talking about dueling prophecies, the Book of Mormon seems to be beating Daniel for now. So I want to, that's really all we kind of know about growth. We know where they're growing, we know that they're growing, and we know that their growth is slowing. Let's talk briefly about politics and the political views of Mormons. This is the Utah Mormons. We're using, in this case, Utah as a stand-in for Mormonism because it's very hard to figure out how else to do this. But if you take the popular vote and you take the Utah vote and you compare the two, you get this kind of offset from the popular vote, which is a reasonable stand-in for the LDS population's offset. And what you find is that Mormons were Democrats at first, and then they became more neutral, and they're still they go Republican and Democrat, Republican and Democrat, depends on who's running, and then from about here on, they become strongly Democrats. I don't think some are strongly Republican, and I don't think anyone is surprised that the majority of Mormons are conservative. But the number that's really interesting is Trump. Trump drove Mormons almost all the way back to neutral, almost. What's interesting about this number, though, is that the people who didn't vote for Trump didn't vote for Clinton either. In 2012 they peak because they have a Mormon option. This is Mitt Romney, and this is Trump. I guess Mitt Romney's back here, and then here's Trump. And again, they didn't vote for Clinton. What they did was they voted for a third-party candidate who also happened to be Mormon, E. McMillan, although a bunch of them also voted Green and Libertarian, and their vote was very split. One has to wonder what might have happened if Mormons en masse had voted for Hillary Clinton. Because so many states were won by a very slight margin, you can almost predict that Clinton would be president today if the Mormons had voted differently. I want to point out that what this means is that Mormons are not in lockstep with the current Trumpian Republican Party, especially on issues like immigration. A lot of Mormons serve missions in foreign places. They're much more likely to speak foreign languages. They're also much more likely to have positive views on immigration, and the church has made official statements about immigration in favor of immigration and that sort of thing. And so, again, they don't agree with him, and they're also very likely to say that people's personal lives matter in their political lives. So they were also more likely to be affected by things like Access Hollywood and to vote against him because of that. But they remain conservative, and they remain opposed to almost all of the Democrats' political positions like abortion and gay rights, etc. We'll see some of those numbers in a bit. So they're still conservative, but they are not in lockstep with the current conservative party, which you can see in Mitt Romney. He's almost a fairly typical Mormon, and he complains about Trump, and he's one of Trump's critics all the time although he is still a Republican and votes with the Republicans on most issues. He's still a critic of Trump. So that's kind of the Mormon political view in the U.S. anyway. The other thing to point out is they're incredibly engaged politically. So not only are they politically conservative, they are also politically engaged, much more than the U.S. population. And even if you adjust the U.S. population for Mormon demographics, they're still more engaged, which means there's something about their religion which is causing the engagement. Right? It's not an engagement that's coming from their demographics. It's coming from their religion. Let's talk about LGBTQ issues and we're going to talk about LGBTQ issues and women's issues specifically in this group, because I know those are issues we care about and because there's also a history of the effect of those issues on the LDS Church. So this is from the 2016 PRRI study, and it gives us a view of how Mormons compare to other religious sects. And I'm sure the numbers are hard to read, but Mormons live right here. And this is on the question of, do you oppose or favor legal government-sanctioned same-sex marriage? This is the gay marriage Prop 8 debate. And Mormons in 2016, they live right about here. And you'll notice that there are only 3 major groups who are, let's be frank, more homophobic than Mormons. And those are the white evangelicals and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so they rank third on kind of this desire to deny people their fundamental civil liberties, using politics to deny people their fundamental civil liberties. And it's not surprising because the church has official statements to this effect.
Yeah, I wonder what that group of the 94% is.
Yeah, that's us. Go figure. Okay, so, and that's why we have a rainbow flag in front of our church. Right? All right, so the question, though, isn't where they're at. It's where they're going to be in the future. So this, and I wish I had the support numbers, but sometimes you find these press releases and they just tell you how many oppose, they don't tell you how many support. But this is the trajectory of the LDS Church from several different studies, right? I'm using the GSS, PPRI, study from 2014, 15, 16, and 17. And the number who are supporting is going up. I really need to find the support numbers from 17 and 14. I couldn't. I'm sure they're on the webpage. I just dug around and couldn't find them. But I've got the opposed numbers, and they're falling. They're not yet at 50%, but dang it, they're close. And so the LDS Church is changing in favor of greater equality, as is the rest of the nation. In fact, again, they're near the bottom, but this one's from Pew. Pew showed the same thing. So when you deal with surveys and polls, it's important to combine multiple sources of data because there's error in polling. And when you get polls that say the same thing from multiple sources, you tend to believe what you're seeing. And so here we have the Mormons, and here we have the Jehovah's Witnesses, and this is their Pew numbers from 2007 to 2014. So in 7 years, the LDS Church grew their support, or their belief that homosexuality should be accepted by 50%. Again, I apologize, we just switched questions. The first question is, should same-sex marriage be legal? This question is, should homosexuals be supported by society? And it turns out there's a lot of people who, in Mormonism, who oppose same-sex marriage, but believe homosexuality should be accepted by society. However, they're defining accepted. I don't think they mean it's not a sin, because we've got other poll results that talk about homosexuality being a sin. I'll show you those in a bit. But it's almost like what they're thinking is we should accept these people. We should be nice to these people, whether we agree with what they're doing or not. We don't think they should be able to be married, but we should accept them. And that's an interesting position, and it's growing among Mormons. And there's at least some set of Mormons who believe that they should be accepted but not allowed to marry. Maybe these are people who believe in civil unions or that sort of thing. So those numbers are also very, very interesting. But when you split this out, I've also got 2016 numbers, though, from the Next Mormon survey. Right? So I just used the Pew, but I've also got the Next Mormon survey, and they asked the exact same question. And it went from 30-something to almost 50% between 14 and 16. So you're almost at half. And again, that's an impressive jump. It's more impressive when we split it out by age. So that last survey was specifically of Mormons, and there's enough of them that we can split them out by age. And what we find is that the millennials are over 50%. Gen X is almost 50%. And it's the boomers and the silent generation who are lagging behind. And the LDS Church leadership is run from the top down by a gerontocracy. And so for the opinions of the millennials to kind of take over, you have to wait for the people, the older people who are in charge, to die. But that tells you that once the millennials are in charge, over 50% of them believe that homosexuality should be accepted by society. So we are in a holding pattern where this is a matter of time, right? And you could argue that as people get older, they become more conservative. But no evidence has been shown that that is the case on views of same-sex marriage and homosexuality. That does not hold for that data. In fact, you can see that this trend, we've got some data that shows politically and other ways how millennials become more conservative over time. In fact, they're more likely to go to church once they have kids and all that sort of stuff. We can track those trends. But even when you take them into account and correct for them, the millennials are more liberal, the millennials are more likely to be irreligious, and they're far more likely to be accepting of homosexuality. And it is true in the LDS Church as well, and it's not going to change as they age. Or if it does, it's not going to change enough. Right? The gap is large enough. In fact, over time, we see that Gen X and the boomers and silent are becoming more accepting of homosexuality, not less. The millennials are just accepting it faster. So, again, this is not the sort of trend that's going to go away over time. And we get to one of the more interesting questions you could possibly ask, and that is in 2015, the LDS Church instituted what's called the POX, or the policy of exclusion, where they essentially said that if you enter into a same-sex relationship, you are guilty of apostasy, and a church court to excommunicate you is required. The bishop doesn't have any choice. And that was part one. And part two, they said that the parents of LGBTQ couples could not be baptized, or hold the priesthood, or participate in certain blessings, etc. And you could ask, why would gay parents want their kids to be baptized? And the people for whom this was a big deal were especially in mixed orientation marriages. A gay person would marry a straight person because the church told them they had to do that. And in 95% of the cases, those marriages would then end in divorce. The gay person would, and it would ruin people's lives. So this is one way that the church really does, just ruin people's lives. And then those people would go off, and the gay partner would go off and get married again to a same-sex partner. And suddenly, their children were not allowed to be baptized. But there was also a believing spouse, usually left behind, who wanted those kids to be baptized. And if that child lived with the gay parents, he or she could not be. If he lived with the straight partner, they could. And so the church claimed they did this, and I believe them, to reduce family stress. Right? We don't want the kids and the parents arguing about whether their parents' marriages are okay. We'll wait till they're 18, then they leave home, they can get baptized. What this actually did was make a whole bunch of divorces that I knew of my friends far more bitter. Because suddenly they were fighting over the divorce and who got the kids, because having complete custody of the kids was necessary for the kids to be able to participate in the church that the believing spouse and the straight spouse still believed in and belonged to, and it created all sorts of family strife. That policy was reversed this year. And it's unclear how it was reversed, because if you look at the handbook, it looks like it's basically the same, but some of the wording was maybe softened, maybe. But they claimed they reversed it, and it doesn't look like they actually did. Either way, both times, the person, Russell M. Nelson, who is now the president of the church, was not in 2015, but the same person who was going to be president of the church stood up and claimed this was a revelation from God. And so we have this situation where he claimed the policy was a revelation, and then he claimed the reversal was a revelation, and it made no sense to a lot of people, and they were very unhappy. So what we want to do here is, and unfortunately, the next Mormon survey was done in 2016, right after the policy came out. So it's got some information on how Mormons reacted to the policy. What it doesn't have is how they reacted to the reversal of said policy. So we need to repeat the next Mormon survey and see what that does. Again, there is a narrative among ex-Mormons that people left the church in droves over this policy and over its change. So let's talk about whether that's accurate. First, do Mormons support it? Do active, current Mormons support it? This is active members who strongly agree, not just agree. I want to actually combine them, but I get data where I get it because the full results of the Next Mormon Survey aren't just out in a data format. I have to get them from the books and things, and they reported the strongly agree. Strongly agree that if gay people marry, they should be excommunicated, and that's apostasy. You get, I can't read my own notes, 60% of the boomers, 30% of all active Mormons. Gen X is at 45%, and the millennials are at 40%. So half of Mormons strongly agree that gay people should be excommunicated. And there's another group that just agree. So this is a strong plurality, agree with part one of the policy. So Mormons aren't going to leave in mass over a policy they agree with. If we break that out by the policy of excluding children, and this one I have summarized by agree, just plain agree and disagree, and there's actually less support for this. Remember the other was just strongly agree. This is agree and strongly agree, and it only adds up to 61%. So there's a greater number who disagree. We got up to 38%. So Mormons were less happy about the idea of excluding gay children because let the little ones come unto me. It's standard Christian doctrine that this violates. So what we know is that among all current Mormons respondents, support for the policy is substantially less enthusiastic when we look at whether the church should bar children of same-sex marriages from baby blessings and baptisms. I'm reading from one of the press releases from the New Mormon Survey analysis. Overall, there's an 11-point drop among the entire active Mormon sample in the percentage of people who strongly agree, from 47 to 36, and a 9-point rise in the percentage who either strongly or somewhat disagree, from 29 to 38. Much of this falls along predictable fault lines. Mormons who hold a current temple recommend are significantly more likely, 55%, than others to say they strongly agree with barring children. Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats. One surprise in the data is the 9-point gender divide. This is really bizarre. 2/3 of men either strongly or somewhat agree with the policy, but only 57% of Mormon women do. So Mormon women are, for whatever reason, more likely to disagree with excluding children. I guess I can sort of see why that would be, right? In fact, 28% of active Mormon women strongly disagree with the policy about children, something that their president said was a revelation. 28% strongly disagree with the supposed revelation from God. A 10-point jump from the men who say they strongly agree, and another 14% of women somewhat disagree. Considering that this is a policy that Elder Russell Nelson said was a revelation from the Lord in early 2016, it's significant that 42% of active Mormon women we know from other data points are very orthodox, more orthodox than the men, in indices of religious belief, but they say that they disagree about this issue. So that was a fascinating case study, I think, in what happens when a prophet gives an unpopular opinion and whether the members kind of fall in line. However, did it lead to a mass exodus? The Next Mormon Survey was really great because it asked the question, how confident are you that you will remain a member of the church long term? That's a very useful question that you can correlate with, do you agree or disagree with the policy? And when you do that correlation, there's actually a strong correlation. Right? If you disagree with the policy, you're less likely to say you're going to stay. However, if you control for all the other factors, there's almost no correlation. And what that means is that the people who were more likely to leave the church because of the policy were already more likely to leave the church, or thought they were, because of other issues. And as these issues come as a constellation, and while I can't say that the policy of exclusion caused a bunch of them to leave, well, I can't say that it wasn't a tipping point. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say. Well, can't say that it wasn't a tipping point. And there's maybe a large number of people who were almost going to leave, and then this tipped them over the edge. I can't say whether that happened or not. I can at least say that a lot of these people were considering leaving anyway. And that's kind of what we can say from this day. So again, the ex-Mormon narrative that the church just hemorrhaged members over this policy issue is just, it's not true. It may be hemorrhaging members over other issues, but they all go together, right? It's not just over this policy. And again, the church is still growing well after 2016. So again, the ex-Mormon narrative about this isn't correct, but it still doesn't look terribly good for the church. In fact, among those who did leave, LGBT issues in the general sense are in the top 3 reasons they list for why they left. So among people who are leaving, the top 3 issues, LGBT issues, are in the top 3 reasons people are leaving. If you would like more data on the church's history with regard to LGBT issues, there's a great book by Gregory A. Prince. He wrote the defining biography for David O. McKay, one of the church's leaders, and he wrote this book about the history of gay rights in the Mormon Church, Intended Actions and Unintended Consequences, which is a fascinating title, and it has the history of all this stuff. It's a really good read. I recommend it. Go ahead.
You said top 3 reasons. What were the other 2?
I'm going to have to look them up. That was in the Next Mormon Survey, gave a list of reasons, and some of them were historical, doctrinal, Joseph Smith, polygamy, and I don't remember what they all were. And it even has those reasons split out by generation. So that data is in the book. I recommend it, but I'm not going to quote it without a graph because I'll get it wrong. Okay, so let's I'm going to quit at 12:15 if that's okay, because normally I have more time for these. And if you need to leave early, that's fine. But I've got a very small chunk of stuff on gender and on race that I just want to go through quickly. So if we look at gender, this is from Pew, and it compares across lots of different churches support for women working outside the home. And what it shows, among other things, is that Mormons think the world is better because women work outside the home at 49%, and they think it's worse at only a rate of 23%, which is still significant. But given that the early leaders of the church talked about how a woman's place is in the home, and if they leave, it's going to lead to all the downfall of society. There's a lot of rhetoric from President Benson about that, and it looks like Mormons have rejected that. And again, historically, there has been the LDS Church officially fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, and has had a lot of rhetoric about how women need to stay home to raise families, and there's an issue with women's ordination. And those are the kind of fault lines on gender issues. And you'll note that on this issue of women working outside the home, there's still some controversy, but they seem to have become much more accepting of women working outside the home. If we talk about the number who are troubled by women's ordination, this is a fascinating graph. And it turns out the average church who is not troubled by women's ordination to a high degree, only 24% for the boomers, almost 50% for Gen X, but millennials are well over 50%. 59% of millennials are troubled by the fact that women don't hold the priesthood. There was a movement in the church called Ordained Women. They excommunicated the leader of that movement, and actually that's when I had my name removed from the church after they did that. And it turns out that again, you're over 50% for millennials, you're at 50% almost for Gen Xers, are people who are troubled by women's ordination issues. So the church has made a bunch of changes to their temple rituals, wording, to some of the leadership roles, to give women a larger leadership position, because they recognize the problems that are inherent, especially in the rising generation, with how women are treated in the church and the feeling that they are treated poorly, and they're moving slowly and incrementally in ways to address that. And so again, if we're talking about trends and you just kind of track this out, we would expect some sort of additional movement on women's ordination as millennials become the leaders of the church, et cetera, in the next few generations. All right, there's a lot more I can say about that, but for time, I just have to run through one or two topics very briefly, and it's frustrating to leave things out, but let's talk about race for a minute. And I'm sorry that I had to take a picture of my book to get this table. I ran out of time this morning as I was trying to put this table in my talk. But this table is about another one of those interesting Mormon policies. Just like the policy of exclusion, there was a policy that black people could not hold the priesthood or enter the temple. And that policy is one of the things that Mormons are known for. They're known for polygamy. They're known for that they excluded black people until 1978. And interestingly enough, Joseph Smith actually ordained black people to the priesthood. So this is one of those things that happened later in the church and then became, and there was folk doctrine connected with it. And so the church leaders taught that, though, as doctrine. And so for many years, they thought it was a doctrinal position that black people could not hold the priesthood. And then in 75, Spencer W. Kimball claimed a revelation from God that black people could hold the priesthood. And the quote that sticks out in my mind about this issue is from then Apostle Bruce R. McConkie, who had written in his own book, Mormon Doctrine, that black people would not get the priesthood until the millennium. And when this revelation happened, he said, "Forget everything I ever wrote about this topic. Forget everything I ever said about this topic. I spoke as a man. I was wrong. Listen to the current revelation. We spoke from a position of darkness. We now speak from a position of light, because now we know what God wants." So again, this shows that the LDS Church is capable of switching on a dime. And when you look at the polls of Mormon people, and I left these out for space reasons, but most of the polls say that Mormons are explicitly, at least, strenuously opposed to racism today. Even though their early leaders supported not only the ban on the priesthood, but also segregation, explicitly talked about segregation being good and that sort of thing. Today, Mormons oppose racism en masse. At least explicitly, they say they do. But if you ask them questions like, black people are more poor than white people, how much of that is due to their own inadequacies versus race? A lot of Mormons, they're kind of the colorblind. We should just be colorblind sort of people who don't see systematic racism for what it is, and don't see the way in which racism in the U.S. and the systematic institutions of race limit people of color. So they actually don't answer those questions. Again, they're Republicans, so we shouldn't be terribly surprised. But their numbers on those survey responses are low. But explicitly enough, they now reject, en masse, the teachings of their past on racism. However, this is the weird bit, if you ask those same people whether the ban was God's will, most of them say that it was. Right? And by is it God's will, I mean, was it God's will that blacks not hold the priesthood until 75, and then God's will on black people changed? And that seems to be the position that most of them hold. That God didn't want black people to have the priesthood, and then God changed his mind in 1978. And that doesn't quite sound as crazy as it needs to. And I didn't mean it to be derogatory when I said God changed his mind. I even didn't, because a lot of what they would say, if you were to ask them, if they were here to defend that position, they would say something along the lines of, God doesn't change, but God recognizes what's best for society, and what God commands us to do depends on the societal situation. Right? So that's how they would defend that position. The societal situation changed, and now God wants us to ordain. But God was guiding us the whole time. The church has an official essay where they say, we banned black people from holding the priesthood because we were racist. I mean, that's really what the essay says, and we apologize for it. That's basically what it says, but apparently the members of the church have not gotten the memo that the official church position has expressed on this issue, which is that it probably was never God's will. It was based on our own biases and racism. Now, you could say that it was God's will because we weren't ready, because we were racist, but the ban, according to the church today, was because of our own racism, the church's own racism, not because of, God somehow didn't like black people for a while and then decided he liked them, right? Nevertheless, it is shocking to me that this high of a percent of members of the church still think, notice, I am confident and sure that it's true that it was God's will. Men, 37%, 36%, and then you add that to, I believe, 27% and 24%. And when you get down in here who don't agree, you're at 11 and 7%. So this, and I think the reason is they're very reticent to say the leaders were wrong, right? And so they must have had a reason, and that reason must have been God's will, even if we don't understand it. And so, yeah, go ahead.
This reminds me an awful lot of the Western Church's attitudes towards the Jews from before and after the Holocaust. In terms of the fact that just like how Mormons collectively blamed black people
I don't know if they actually did that. But,
well,
oh, well, okay, so if you're talking about the folk doctrine of Cain,
yeah. Doctrine of Cain. I mean, there were more legalistic reasons for it, but folk doctrine of Cain was a big difference. So, and same thing with Christianity. There were more specific reasons, but the big thing was the fact that Jews were collectively responsible for killing Jesus and remained so unless they abandoned their old religion.
right, that was the folk doctrine that the Christians in Western taught about why God didn't approve of Jewish people. So I think there's similar.
How it compares with the Mormon attitudes on black people.
Yeah, and I don't know how the kind of Western churches have changed on that view of Jews kill Jesus sort of thing. But it is sort of similar in the sense that both of them had this folk doctrine about why black people couldn't have the priesthood. In Mormon cases, it was because they believed that they were cursed by Cain. It was the curse of Cain that had continued through the generations. And that was the folk doctrine that was taught. And then it was coupled with they were less valiant in the pre-earth life before they came to this life. But again, those were the doctrines that were taught. Now, another really important point is that Mormons will tell you that their doctrine has never changed. They are wrong. But they redefine doctrine as anything that does change must not have ever been doctrine. But if we just define doctrine in an objective sense as that which was taught and claimed to be doctrine by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 at the time, doctrines of the LDS Church have changed, and they've changed on issues where the brethren said they will never change. And the reason that's important is because it tells us what the hope is for change in LGBT issues. Right? Because they're currently saying, this is a revelation from God, it can never change, it will never change. But they said the same thing about race, and they said the same thing about polygamy, and both of those things have changed. And a lot of other things have changed too. Those are just examples. This is one of them. But it's interesting to note that when it does change, you get this interesting statistical opinion that Mormons will tend to answer, it was God's will then, it's not God's will now. And so that's what they did with race. So that's what they seem to be doing with race. The number who say it was never God's will and disagree with the idea that it was, is fairly low. This is the weirdest of the answers, though. Now, if anyone can explain to me what the heck is going on here, please do, because I don't get it. But 61% of white Mormons say that they know or believe that that the ban was God's will, and then it changed. 70% of non-white Mormons think that the ban was God's will, and then it changed. And I don't understand that, except I knew a couple of believing black members of the church, and I asked them their question about this issue regarding race. And they were the sort of person who said, I've prayed a lot about this because it impacts me directly, and I feel like God didn't want us to hold the priesthood then because it would have caused problems for the church, and he does now, and I'm glad he does now. But I think God is guiding the church because I've had to pray about this, right? And so I get the impression that that's maybe what's going on, but it is a really, truly strange result from the survey. And I am out of time. Are there any burning questions? I guess I can say that recommendations, that the book on the history of gay rights and the LDS Church, intended consequences, unintended actions, is a very good read. If I'm recommending things, there's obviously the Next Mormons survey. And then if you want to talk about how doctrine has changed, which is the other thing I mentioned, there's a book called This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology by Charles R. Harrell, who is a believing Mormon who worked at BYU, who wrote a book kind of chronicling the history and the change of all sorts of different doctrines in the LDS Church, where they came from, how they changed over time, etc. So this is a really good read. This one's a really good read. And then the one on the history of the LDS Church is also a very good read. And then, if you have any burning questions, go ahead. I mean, I probably can't answer them because if they're questions about survey data, I'd have to look them up. But there's more I could have talked about, but given that I haven't prepared that. Any thoughts, questions? All right. Feel free to come talk to me after, and thank you for coming.